everybody, and welcome to another meeting of the Ghoul Guides Association. I am Lauren.
And I'm Mary.
And we are the Ghoul Guides, in case that wasn't self-explanatory. And if you're new here, or you're thinking, what the hell are these girls doing? This is a show slash session slash meeting where we get together and we talk about all things Gothic and Gothic related. Sometimes we might have guests, who knows? We're going to see what happens. This is only the second time really that we're doing this. But today I have chosen a topic that I think is quite pertinent to current events, and perhaps one that people don't realise is actually quite Gothic in origin. I don't know why I'm saying it like that, because you totally already know what I'm going to talk about, which just kind of could defeat the point. Like, part of the point of this is that the other one doesn't really know much, but actually what we're going to talk about today is gaslighting.
Everyone's favourite topic.
Everyone's favourite topic. I was about to be like, Mary, I know that you know a lot about gaslighting, and then I realised it makes it sound like I've gaslit you.
Or that I gaslight all the time. I'd like to add for the record that neither of us gaslight, you know.
No, we do not. We're not gaslighters. I mean, the more we deny it, the more we do sound like gaslighters. But the reason I said that is because you were sat next to me when we watched the film that I will be talking about in this session. But I really, you know, I've been thinking recently, there's a lot of discussion about gaslighting in the news, because I mean, I think I said this last time, it doesn't matter which country you're listening from, this probably applies to you. There's a lot of gaslighting right now in politics. There's a lot of gaslighting in, you know, in cultural news and pop culture. There's a lot of this conversation about who is a gaslighter and what is gaslighting. And actually, this is something that has a really, really strong Gothic history. And I thought, fun is probably the wrong word. I thought it would be interesting to talk about why we use the term gaslighting, what it actually means and where it comes from. So you are going to have to kind of pretend a little bit today, Mary, like you don't know what I'm talking about up until a certain point, and then you can regain your knowledge.
I do just want to say though, I think, you know, like, it's a term that everyone throws around all the time, and it's often like misused. So I think that, like, this will be really interesting to kind of delve into like where it comes from or what it actually means, because like you say, like there is a lot of gaslighting at the moment in pop culture, but also in politics, and just like our online ecosystem is full of people like accusing other people of gaslighting or identifying things as gaslighting. And it's like, not everything is gaslighting, but there are certain instances that are, you know, harmful, or, you know, all those kinds of things.
Yes.
So yeah, I think this is a good
110%. It's really abused. And actually, maybe after, like, we've talked about this a little bit, I actually think as well, like, the way that we overuse gaslighting, and I know I'm not the first person to say this, but it's kind of similar to the way that we use terms like psycho and narcissist and sociopath, and
not everyone in your life is a narcissist.
Yeah, there's very much, I think there's been some like work by psychologists on this, like the way that we overuse these terms, that also kind of has a bit of a Gothic linking, because the reason why we overuse these terms is because of the way they come into like our social consciousness. But did you know that gaslighting as a term has only really been used since the 2010s?
I did not, but that's an interesting fact. And yeah, I can believe that. Yeah,
it's only since the 2010s. I don't know why, but I thought before I started my research that it was very much a post-millennial thing. I knew that it was something that, it's not like that it didn't, you know, the film I'm about to talk about didn't happen and everyone started using it, but I definitely thought that we had been using the term gaslighting for longer than we had, which is really interesting. Potentially a bit of a what's it called, Mandela effect thing there, that I definitely thought we'd been using it for longer than we'd had. But I think that's partially because of how it comes into social consciousness and how we've kind of like started using it in pop culture. So as a colloquialism, gaslighting has been used since the 2010s. It was kind of officially recognized by like Merriam-Webster and Oxford English Dictionary and stuff around about like 2016 to 2018, which again is really recent. Also coincides with Me Too movement, which is a really specific reason for the popularity of this term. But it actually comes from the 1930s. So
what?
Please
tell us why.
I know, the 1930s. So in 1938, a guy called Patrick Hamilton, a very famous English playwright, was friends with Priestley, who wrote an Inspector Calls, had a very bad time. I was actually reading about this earlier when I was doing my research. I knew that he had written the play after I think he was like hit by a car or something, like he had an accident, and I knew that he was kind of like trapped in his room, and that was partially what inspired this. He actually had a really dark time, so it's kind of no wonder he wrote something like this. But he in 1938 writes a play, and it's really popular on the English stage. It's then turned into a British movie first in 1940. Gaslight. So 2 words. So gaslight. Sometimes sometimes you see it as gas lamp, because England, but gaslight. So then there's a 1940 film, which is very, very faithful to the play. And then in 1944, we get an MGM movie. So MGM at this time, one of the biggest studios in Hollywood, multiple award-winning actors and actresses, and they make a version of it. They change quite a lot. The names of the characters are different, the situations of the characters are different, but the basic concept is the same, and they make it 1 word. So it becomes Gaslight, all 1 word. So the film wins Oscars. It is got an absolutely star kind of jam-packed cast. Troy Boyer is in it, who was in Love Affair, which was a really popular movie from I think 1939. Starlet Ingrid Bergman was in it, and she won Best Actress for this movie. Joseph Cotton is in it, and those of you who are Agatha Christie on TV fans, or fans of the Disney movie Bedknobs and Broomsticks, as I was as a child, it's the first role, I think the first proper role, that Angela Lansbury, Miss Murder, She Wrote herself, it's her first like on-screen role. And she plays the maid Nancy. So also, fun fact, Angela Lansbury, national treasure.
When did this film come out?
1944.
How old is Angela Lansbury?
I don't know. She's really in this movie though. She's about 17, 18 in this movie. She's really young in this film. Because yeah, I thought the same. I think for us like as millennials that grew up knowing her from things like Murder, She Wrote and like Nanny McPhee and stuff like that, she's a little bit like Judi Dench. I've always thought of her, and this is not to be offensive, as old. Like she's always like, you know, she's always been at the like later stages of her career. I don't know how old she was when she was playing Jessica in Murder, She Wrote, but
for me, like I remember her from Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and then I also, you know, obviously she's iconic as you know, Jessica in Murder, She Wrote, but she just looks, I mean, I guess she's like an older woman, but also like she looks fabulous. Like,
yeah,
I don't know.
Right?
I wouldn't have said that she's old enough to have starred in a film in the 40s.
No.
You know?
Funnily enough, I think she was also in the big film adaptation of The Picture of Dorian Gray, and I think perhaps, I think she was Sybil. That was like one of the other first roles. Maybe she got some ideas from that movie, and she also has a portrait in the Attic, because like she looks very good and is a great actress. It's really funny as well, because I always think of her in these kind of like very relatable roles. She's usually the person in the thing that she's in that you like, and she's quite evil in Gaslight. Like she's real shady. She's very sus in this movie, for reasons that I will explain. So yeah, the film Gaslight, 1944, absolute smash hit, Hollywood classic. Changes the plot somewhat, but it keeps the central theme. And essentially, the movie is about Ingrid Bergman's character, who has a very traumatic past. So when she's a teenager, she's raised by her aunt, who I think she's an opera singer, and she essentially in this very Gothic moment that reminds me very much of something like Claremont comes in to the house and witnesses like her aunt's murder. So someone has broken in, is in the process of robbing them, and the only reason he doesn't finish robbing them is because this like 14-year-old, Ingrid Bergman, I think her name's Paula in the film, interrupts it. So she has this very traumatic childhood experience. She's always very worried about like intruders and her safety. Understandably, she witnessed her, she's an orphan, she's raised by her aunt, she witnesses her caregiver being murdered, so that someone can steal her very expensive jewelry. As a teenager, so kind of no wonder. So you have this woman who is very much alone in the world, who has had this real trauma, and she meets this dude and they have a whirlwind romance. So it kind of starts out a little bit like Rebecca. They meet, they get married very quickly. I think they meet and they get married like after two or 3 weeks. I think it's like a fortnight, like she's on holiday somewhere. So almost exactly the same as the beginning of Rebecca, which would have been written a couple of years before this. So she marries this guy who says his name is Gregory, and he's like, hey, your aunt had this townhouse in London, I'll support you and look after you, you can finally get over your trauma, let's go live in this townhouse in London. She has not been in this townhouse since she was 14. She has no friends in London. Like all of her friends, I can't remember if she's living in France or somewhere, but basically her whole community is somewhere else. So he convinces her that she has him now. She can rely on him, and they should move to London to live in this townhouse where she witnessed this horrendous act. First thing he does is suggest they move all of her aunt's stuff up into the attic and then lock the attic so that it doesn't disturb her. So he isolates her, he replaces everything. And at the beginning of the film, he still seems very loving, very caring. And you are kind of like, oh, this poor girl, she's so traumatized. Like even from the beginning, like she's not very trusting. You do get this impression that she's quite easily spooked. But then as the film goes on, so they have this maid called, I think it's Nancy, and that's Angela Lansbury, and she becomes like, the Ingrid Bergman's character becomes convinced that Nancy hates her. And when she tells her husband about this, her husband's like, what are you talking about? She's like a lovely girl. Like, why are you saying these things? So she starts to unravel or seem like she's unraveling.
I think
she goes, yeah. So like there's one bit where I think they're at like a horse show or something, and she's definitely got this brooch, this heirloom brooch that he's given her in her handbag safely, and she loses it. She's like, I don't know how I could have possibly lost it because it was in my handbag. And he's like, well, you must have been careless with it. And then his pocket watch goes missing and all this other stuff, like a picture's moved. And he starts to kind of be like, darling, you're too stressed and you need to rest. And the other thing that keeps happening is she is convinced she can hear footsteps in the attic, the locked, sealed attic. And he's like, there's no way that anybody can be in that attic. You've got to be hearing things. And she keeps saying to the maid and to her husband that the lights are flickering. So the gas lights are flickering. So that's where the gaslight thing comes from, because she's saying the lights keep flickering and he's saying, no, absolutely no way. I've never seen that happen. I think you might be going insane. I think it's all becoming too much for you. She's isolated, she's basically like dependent on him, and she starts falling apart. She's like, oh God, am I going insane? Am I crazy? Am I just too overwhelmed? And
I mean, of course you would, right? I mean,
right?
You've known someone for like 2-3 weeks, and then suddenly you're married, and that's like a kind of like, a big indissoluble union under God. And then you go back to the site of your childhood trauma.
Literally, let's go back and live in the murder house.
Yeah, like, I mean, red flag. Don't get married to someone that you've only just met. And 2, don't let him convince you that you should return to the murder house that you grew up in. Like,
if the Gothic has taught us anything, it is do not marry someone you've just met.
And avoid the murder house. Like, avoid the murder house.
Don't go back to the murder house.
Don't go back to the murder house. Like, and it was like, oh man, you carry on. But I mean, I just had to jump in there and be like, red flag.
I know, red flag. Literally so many red flags. Red flag.
It's also reminding me of the yellow wallpaper. And that okay.
Funny that you should say that.
Okay.
You should say that, Mary Going. She's so sharp. This is why you're a doctor. So yeah, the flickering gaslight becomes the big thing. She's adamant this gaslight is flickering. He's like, no, there's no way. You're imagining things. You're going crazy. So he says, I think you need to go to the hospital for a little while. So basically he tries to have her institutionalized.
Yeah, of course.
That
old chestnut.
Of course. Yeah, that old chestnut. She becomes like worried and convinced that she's going insane. Essentially, spoiler alert, she's not going insane. I'm not gonna say what actually happens at the end of the film, because it is quite a good twist. As a modern viewer, you probably do see it coming quite early on, but for a film made in the 40s, like I think it's a really good twist. So I don't want to spoil it, because if you haven't seen this movie,
yeah, it's like one of these things, like we could probably see it because like this is where like all the films and media that we consumed have like been what they've been inspired by, but at the time it was quite like new and innovative.
Yes, exactly. And essentially, not only is the gaslight flickering actually happening, it's him. He's the what, like when the gaslight flickers, it's because he's doing something. And of course he's the one that's manipulating all these he's the one stealing the things or moving the things and then telling her it's her and challenging her understanding. I'm not going to tell you why he's doing it or what's actually going on, because it is a really great twist. And
as someone him. And as someone, like what I would say is if you have married someone that you've only known for 3 weeks, and you have moved back into the murder house that you grew up in, and then all this stuff starts happening, but everyone says that you're crazy, get out your phone and record stuff and document. Evidence is always the way to kind of counter this, and also just for yourself to stop you from thinking, but am I going crazy?
Am I insane? PSA, we have technology, use it to your advantage.
Exactly. And even just a pen and paper,
it seems ridiculous,
but even just a pen and paper because like writing down when all the gaslights are flickering, you might find a pattern when they only flicker around this weirdo that I've just married, like maybe it's
when he's not in the room.
Like...
Yeah, exactly. So the gaslight becomes the emblem of her thinking she's insane, but also his manipulation of her. And by the end of the film, like, of course, her knight in shining armor appears. Another guy comes in and essentially saves her from the situation. But it kind of, it becomes the emblem of the situation that she's trapped in. And yes, it has massive shades of Charlotte Gilman Perkins, 1890. I have written what looks like a 2, but it might be a 4 because my handwriting is terrible. Novella, The Yellow Wallpaper, which is a very similar situation. A woman has been locked in her bedroom by her husband. It's from her perspective. It's got real shades of Jane Eyre and Bertha Mason. And you don't know whether or not she's going insane or she's being manipulated into going insane. And this is a kind of, I want to say trope, more like a convention. It's a convention, isn't it, that has always been a classic in the Gothic. So it goes right back to like Castles of Athland and Bane by Anne Radcliffe, like one of her first Gothic novels. There's 2 women locked up. They're not necessarily being convinced they've gone insane, but they're locked up, no one knows they're there. In Sicilian Romance, her second novel, the mother is, spoiler alert, literally locked underneath the castle because he wanted to marry someone else, and she hasn't somehow managed to preserve her sanity. But as this trope goes on, like by the time you get to say The Italian, where you find out the mother is alive and living in not an asylum because they're set in the medieval, but in a nunnery, she has started to lose her sense of identity. And then in the 19th century, you get things like Wilkie Collins as The Woman in White, which does this very same thing. They isolate the women, they convince them of a narrative, they make it so no one believes them, everyone thinks they've gone insane, and it's basically like discrediting women's stories. So the term gaslighting as a convention, what takes place in the movie is just like the latest modern update to something that Gothic stories have been doing for, like, by that point, hundreds of years.
I think that's so fascinating, because it's exactly like what you've said. Like, yeah, it goes back to all of these Gothic texts, and we have to think about why that is. And what I always find really interesting about Gothic narratives is that they're often written by women about women's experience, and it's like, well, what is there that kind of unifies these experiences? And it's the idea that women and women's bodies specifically are controlled by men, and when women become difficult, men often use different kinds of techniques to control women, whether that be physically putting them in a dungeon under the castle, or putting them in an asylum and telling them that they've gone mad. It's a way to kind of negate women's truths in order to manipulate situations. And yes, it's exactly there. It's there from Radcliffe, a kind of classic Gothic author, and it's also like, you know, all the way through the 19th century and the 20th century, and even like in our contemporary period. I think excellent linking, Lauren. Yeah,
well, it's true. And one of the important things here is that the key thing with gaslighting is that as strong or as independent as the victim is, they start to question their sanity. A really great modern example, which is a text that's very much inspired by the Yellow Wallpaper, is Sylvia Moreno Grace's Mexican Gothic. Has it intentionally is using these Gothic tropes and reimagining them. And actually what happened, if you haven't read this novel, you need to read it, but what happens at the end of Mexican Gothic is this kind of blending of it's true and it's not true, like what you expected to happen and what you think you're being led to expect to happen, you know, your expectations are met and diverted at the same time, because you're like, are they going insane? Are they imagining it? And that's the thing about gaslighting, is that in the Gothic, every time gaslighting happens, from, you know, shall we call it gaslighting, up until gaslighting gets its name. So your Beth Masons, you know, your Radcliffean mothers, your Wilkie Collins Woman in White characters, and that's not the only novel that happens in the 19th centuries, but all of these women do start to wonder and question. They lose their grip on reality. So it kind of has, like, I would say four key things that happen in gaslighting: isolation, blame, breaking down, and brainwashing. Because to successfully gaslight, you have to convince somebody that basically they're losing their sanity, and that the thing that you're saying to them is true, be that no, you can't hear footsteps, and no, the gaslights aren't flickering, or be that, you know, no, you didn't see what you thought, you know, you didn't see me murder that person, or you didn't see what you think you saw, or you don't know what you think you know. The idea is they do start to lose their sanity. So this is kind of like what has to happen for it to be gaslighting. Not that anyone should be taking this as like a playbook. It's just that they are like the criteria. So don't do this. So what's really, like, what makes gaslighting so terrifying and effective as a convention, and this is why the Gothic is so important, is that it works. So as you mentioned, it's mostly women and women writers. Can you guess what contemporary event has been cited as being most responsible for the popularization of the term gaslighting?
Oh, there's so many. You're gonna have to tell me.
There are so many.
You're gonna have to
it's the accusations and trial of Harvey Weinstein. Because Harvey Weinstein gaslit, that's what he did. He convinced, the reason, like, we know now, that the reason that all of these women didn't come forwards is because they were convinced that they had earned it in some way, that they had been consenting, that they, you know, had somehow been responsible, that it was just them, that they were isolated. And actually what Weinstein was doing again and again was gaslighting. So I said at the beginning, like the Me Too movement, but specifically this incident with Weinstein and the coverage around Weinstein was actually the thing most people think really brought this into focus, because what he did was systematic gaslighting. So what's really fascinating is that all the way through from, you know, a way in which you communicate to one another the dangers, like this is kind of what the Gothic always is. It's either a way to scare people into conforming, or a way to share with one another the dangers and the potential terrors and protect one another from it. And that's why often it's women writing for women, sharing that understanding. So this like pattern of behavior has been passed through the generations of women and shared as a danger. And what's really interesting is that even the way that we're using it as a pop culture term actually comes from a huge instance of that behavior happening, but also, you know, specifically in like the entertainment industry. So like the business of fiction, a place in which women were being put in that situation, which I'm not trying to say that what happened with Weinstein is Gothic, but what I think is really interesting is that it reminds us of how the Gothic is something that we have used for generations and generations, like oral storytelling, to try and protect us and to hand down that kind of shared knowledge and experience. And even though gaslighting as a term is coming specifically from the way that Boyer's character in the movie treats Bergman's character, what's really fascinating is that we've all accepted gaslighting as a term. Not everybody knows why it's called gaslighting, but when you say to someone now, that's gaslighting behavior, very few people are going to go, hey, what's gaslighting? I don't know what that is, which is really interesting, the way that we've kind of like internalized it. What's less fun and less interesting is, as you said at the beginning, it has become overused. So Mary, are you aware of the fact that gaslighting also now has its own meme?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. The best things in pop culture have their own memes.
Always.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar, the meme is gaslight gatekeep girl boss. And it's very much taking shots at the very much millennial culture of women who promoted themselves as like being female bosses, who ran these, you know, women focused companies and turned out to be super toxic, have really poor work environments, to be very toxic to other women, particularly women of color, particularly to minorities. And, you know, a lot of this came out. I'm not going to name names of companies because I don't want to get sued. But you can probably find them online really easily. And there's definitely Netflix documentaries about some of them. Some of them were MLMs, which is one of my favorite things to talk about. But again, won't do that without doing my legal fact checking first. So yeah, so Gaslight Gatekeep Girl Boss became this meme. But it, you know, that's actually one of the occasions where it's not necessarily an overusage, because actually what a lot of these women in these powerful positions were doing were gaslighting their staff. But as I said at the beginning, gaslighting's become a term that we overuse. We use it to describe kind of just like shitty behavior, rather than actual gaslighting. And I get why that's happened. It's important to call out people when they're being shitty. But considering how serious gaslighting is, it's probably something that we shouldn't overuse. And as I said, to really call something gaslighting, for something to really be gaslighting, it needs to follow that pattern. And the isolation is one of the big things. Like, you must, you know, isolate someone, and it's not always women. We see a lot of this behavior in corporate situations. We see a lot of this behavior in academic situations, and it's not always physical isolation. It's often like mental and emotional isolation. It happens a lot with minorities working in large companies or in like, you know, fandom spaces and government spaces, but that kind of cycle of isolation, blame, breakdown of reality, and then brainwashing is this kind that's very much what gaslighting does. So interestingly, would you say, what would you like, what would you say, Mary, are like some of the terms we overuse the most? Because I definitely think this goes super in line, and like I said, I'm not the first person to say this, with the way that we overuse terms like psycho and sociopath.
Oh yeah,
And
absolutely. Psychopath is another one that people think, you know, just because they've seen one of those, you know, Channel 5 documentaries on like 5 psychopaths, or like, you know, the kind of like, you know, is this person evil? Are they a psychopath? Or maybe both? You know, I think sometimes people think that they could just identify a psychopath in real life, and you know, I mean, let's face it, they're probably mostly going to be working in the banking industry, but that doesn't mean that they're everywhere, you know. And it's the same with sociopath. It's the same with narcissist. Narcissist is another one where I feel like maybe these people are just selfish. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're, you know, they have a narcissistic personality to that extent. And the overuse of it, I think, is really interesting, because I think in a way it almost feeds into this kind of, I say almost because I'm not going to use it this way, but it almost feeds into the gaslighting kind of tool of manipulation itself, because it creates a narrative where, because all of these terms are overused, therefore oh no, what I'm doing to you is not gaslighting, because everyone overuses gaslighting. But it's like what you said, like there are ways to identify it, and this is why I think, you know, Gothic narratives are really important, because, you know, people often dismiss genre stuff of it not being you know, important, or not having anything to say, or, you know, oh, this is just, you know, romance and nobody needs to worry about that, or this is just horror and it's grotesque and it's surface level and there's nothing underneath. But what Gothic narratives are doing is like the whole whisper network with women.
Yes, exactly.
It's a way to
it's passing notes in the back of class.
Passing notes in the back of class and telling people, hey, this is behavior that we should, you know, look out for and be worried about. And again, you know, like red flag, red flag, red flag. Just because you can identify some red flags doesn't mean that you shouldn't, you know, do things, but you should just be aware and be cautious, you know. Exactly. It's not like you can't start a relationship with somebody that you've only met for 2 weeks, but maybe don't get married to them. Like that's the whole point, right? It's like, exactly. It's not that you should.
It's meant to be about social progress.
Exactly.
It's meant to be about progress. And this is what's really interesting. So again, this is very much me observing as, you know, an academic individual or just an individual. What's really interesting is that we started to overuse the term gaslighting as a global culture, partially because of true crime and horror, two genres that are very, very closely tied to the Gothic. Because, you know, we've seen in recent years lots of really fantastic, particularly horror and thriller, like I don't know if we want to call the remake a remake, but the Invisible Man film, the more recent one. We've seen lots of movies of, you know, that focus around particularly women being institutionalized. I mean, even going back to things like Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. That's a really great example of a text in which gaslighting is used. But in the same way, it's super easy to make a cheap horror about a psychopath, because everybody can go, oh my god, psychopathy is terrifying. It's because it's so like, oh, it's, you know, it's so unnatural. Psychopaths are terrifying. We get a lot of documentaries, we get a lot of true crime, but it's that thing again of like, there's like the two different strands. And what's so fascinating is you have, for example, true crime like My Favorite Murder, like Murder Makeup Mystery Mondays, like some of the more recent documentaries on platforms like Netflix that take these very considered approaches to things like psychopathy and sociopathy. Why did these things happen? And the same thing with gaslighting. But then we also get it as, you know, B movies, and we get it as, you know, like trashy horror and episodes of things. And what's interesting is that it's almost like that thing that we've talked about before with the Gothic, where on the one hand, if everybody knows what gaslighting is, we're safe from it. But also, if everybody knows what gaslighting is, it diminishes it. Oh, you know, that's gaslighting behavior. Like, ugh, you know, it's somehow like, well, if you didn't know it was gaslighting, then you're the problem, because everybody knows what gaslighting is now. Like, it's kind of that thing, like, it's your fault because you had sex on prom night and that's why the murderer came for you. You should have known for watching all those horror movies that was gonna happen. Like, it's that weird, like, Gothic rebellion versus Gothic conventionalizing thing.
Yeah, just because, you know, just because you've missed all the red flags and you've married that guy that you've known for 2 weeks and you're now living in a murder house, what happens then isn't your fault. Like that, like it's still on the other person. Like it's not like, you know, just because everyone knows about gaslighting that everyone should be aware and therefore be able to protect themselves from it, or,
yeah,
you know, inoculate themselves from it.
Yeah, the really key thing about the movie Gaslight is that it establishes right at the beginning that Ingrid Bergman's character is a vulnerable person. She's witnessed this murder as a young woman. She is very much alone in the world, and at no point of the movie are you supposed to be like, she's stupid, why has she married him? Partially because meeting people and getting married after 2 weeks was something that people did, but also, like, whirlwind romances are supposed to be romantic, and vulnerable people are often more vulnerable to things like that because they don't have that support system, they don't have that network. So the film very clearly is, as much as it's a 1940s film and obviously she gets saved by a dude, it's very much a film about, like, be aware of these men who will abuse your desire for romance and for love and affection, and misuse you and abuse you and manipulate you. What's really interesting is that Gothic full circle, and that's just why I mentioned this, because I do think it's really interesting. I keep saying I think it's really interesting. Note to self: read a thesaurus, come up with new words, Lauren. There are other ways to say things. I have a degree in English literature, and all I can say is I find it really interesting. But yeah, like, it's super fascinating. It is intriguing, alluring, some may say. To just know that the term gaslighting comes from a very Gothic movie that's drawing on pre-existing Gothic conventions from multiple types of Gothic media, and that even now the way that we have, like, internalized gaslighting both as a concept and as a term into modern society is mirroring this Gothic cycle and mirroring the Gothic conventions. Like, it comes into our vocabulary because it's this awful event that is at once a pop culture phenomenon and just emblematic of our social issues that we are still arguing about as to whether or not the Me Too movement is a good or a bad thing. The Me Too movement itself was appropriated in the first place. That now gaslighting has become something that people, I mean, gosh, like, I remember last year, on this has come to mind because I don't know when we're going to put this out, but Love Island started this week. Someone was tweeting last year saying, like, this person's behavior on Love Island is gaslighting, and actually what the dude was doing to the girl was gaslighting. But the way that then we, like, attack, like, everybody jumps out on it on Twitter, and often the response, someone will say that's gaslighting, and the response to the person who says that's gaslighting is for a huge group of people to gaslight the person who has called out the gaslighting by saying, no, it's not. That's not gaslighting. No lights are flickering here. You cannot hear any footsteps in the attic. And yeah, it's just this weird Gothic Ouroboros, just everything eating its tail.
I think what's interesting about that, and just about, you know, just in general gaslighting, is that actually, like, everyone is fallible. And if there's anything that we know about, you know, specifically like eyewitness testimony or those kinds of, you know, character witness testimonies or testimonials is that they're incredibly biased and they can be manipulated, and that often, you know, eyewitnesses will produce wildly different accounts of the same events, and therefore we should always be a little bit not suspicious, but like maybe not take everything with, you know, take everything at face value, always have that little bit of grain of salt. And I think for some people, especially everyone who's like, no, that's not gaslighting, and that whole thing, it's because I think we have a perception that we alone know the truth, that there is a truth out there to be known. And I think that's, you know, just as not dangerous, but it's you know, we should be wary about that. You know,
well, I wrote this in my notes, and
we need nuance, basically, is what I'm saying.
we need nuance. I wrote this in my notes, and then I like wrote a little arrow and was like, is this relevant? Your podcast is about Gothic. But what is like again, like comes back multiple times is that we have that tension between believe survivors and don't take everything at face value, and that can create so much toxicity. But the way that we use gaslighting and the way that we think about gaslighting like creates this kind of toxic space in which people start to question what they saw and start to question if like, well, where did I get that opinion from? Why do I think that way? Why did I think that that had happened? And yeah, the way that we've kind of like internalized, I think I keep saying internalized, but I don't know how else to explain it, because what's also just really weird is so many people don't know where this term comes from, but we all as a modern society accept that gaslighting means gaslighting, which is also just really weird. I've lost my train of thought, but also my notes were not great. I have done that thing where I have written something and then assumed that future Lauren will know exactly what that means.
I think it's really true. You know, sometimes, especially now, because we're online so much, and these terms can just kind of pop up, and if you're not online 24/7, you might not know where these terms come from. But also, like, you know, even if you do know where they come from in terms of the internet, you know, it kind of came about in the 2010s. There's all of this other kinds of interesting context that is actually relevant, you know, and I think it is that, you know, that history of being a kind of a Gothic narrative or a tool within Gothic narratives, and just going back to, well, what was the film Gaslighting, what was the film Gaslight about, but then also tying it to, you know, the Yellow Wallpaper, to Wilkie Collins and to Anne Radcliffe, and all of these kinds of texts that are about women's experience.
Yes, it also comes back to that thing. I think this is maybe what Path Lauren's note was supposed to be about. She needs clarity. You would think she would have learned this after years of the PhD. Mary used to see my handwritten notes, so she knows how bad they are. But I think it's that idea of, like you just said, of fallibility. The whole Gothic, in the way that Gothic is revolutionary. So yes, there is a whole Gothic that is very conventional, and that's what we often call the sit down and shut up Gothic. But the Gothic that's revolutionary and the Gothic that's trying to you know, uncover and support, part of the point is it could happen to anybody. And weirdly, the popularization and understanding of things like psychopath, gaslight, narcissism, and the acceptance that it could happen to anybody has kind of backfired and 180'd on itself. And, you know, you saw this with something like the Tinder swindler. So the Tinder swindler was such a textbook example of gaslighting, to manipulate somebody to get something from them. And in the Gothic, gaslighters always want something. They're always trying to steal property or money or title, or, you know, it's very rarely just about like physical desire. It's usually either about a control kick or a material gain. The Tinder swindler was 100% about that. You know, that story could have been told in 1798 and people would have gone, yes, that's a Gothic tale. Unfortunately, it's a true story. So many people responded to that documentary and were like, it would never be me. Those girls were dumb. And part of you watches it and is like, oh, hon, come on. we all know not, like you said, we know not to marry the man we've just met 2 weeks ago. We know not to send the guy who's supposedly a diamond heir thousands of dollars. But do we? And I think that's the thing that we lose sometimes, because we can become detached from it, because we can the terror is desensitized. Like Gaslight for me is a really scary film. It's the same reason that I always say that like The Wicker Man is the scariest film I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And it's not just because I'm such a coward that I can't watch horror. That terrifies me. Like that idea of like loss of rationale and reason, and that's essentially what happens in Gaslight. She comes so close to believing him, and even though you as a viewer are on her side and you're like, no, figure it out, you understand why she falls for it. It's not that she's weak or that she's stupid or anything like negative, but somehow because we've become so desensitized to it, like the terror, we've lost the terror of it in a way. And I wonder, I would put money on in the next like 2 years we get a revival of films like Gaslight, because I think we're gonna have that thing again of it's coming back full circle. We had a bunch of films come out sort of like 2018, so like 2 years after the Weinstein and the Me Too incidents like started coming to light. I think we're probably gonna get some stuff in the next couple of years. I think it's probably already starting to happen. I haven't seen.
I mean, I was going to say it's not exactly about gaslighting, but it is in the kind of I guess not a response to, but just following on from, I guess, the whole Me Too conversation that you know, it's, yes, Me Too was appropriated. We should always recognize that. We should also remember that it's, you know, in terms of what, you know, as a society and as a global world, what did we actually get from that? Harvey Weinstein's in jail and what else? Not really much else. But the idea that, you know, we have at the moment, I think we're seeing a backlash to the Me Too movement,
yes,
but it's still ongoing.
Backlash.
But a film that came out recently is a film called Men.
Oh my gosh, that's what I was just about to say. I haven't watched it yet, but the new A24 movie Men.
I haven't watched it either, and the reviews that I've heard
the way
of it,
they're promoting
it, but I think the reviews that I've heard of it can be summed up as it has an interesting concept, but it doesn't really reach the full potential, and part of that is probably because it's written and directed by a man. And I think there's only so much that you can do in terms of, you know, the idea around not all men and Me Too and feminism, if you don't have kind of input from women. But I think even just that concept of, you know, you have a village where every single man is played by the same actor, whatever age. I mean that in itself is terrifying. And I think exactly. We had the Invisible Man with Elizabeth Moss. I think exactly we are going to start to see
I think we're going to have a bit of a revival again. I thought that when I saw the trailers for Men. I think that's one of the reasons I started thinking about doing this episode about gaslighting, is that I was thinking, because there's a bit in the trailer where I think it's the priest character says to her like, oh well, if you'd been different, or if you'd behaved different, your husband wouldn't be dead. And that obviously is such a kind of powerful thing that happens a lot, particularly when victims are gaslit, because victims are gaslit quite often. I think we're going to see more Gothic about gaslighting, but going back to the origins of gaslighting and reclaiming the terror of it, and that actually it can happen to anybody. It can happen to you. Like Bergman's character is a very vulnerable person, and she is the prime victim for that kind of abuse. But I do wonder if it's going to kind of go full circle. I'm interested. That's my prediction. Hot off the press, people. The Ghoul Guides predict more Gaslight Gothic. No one steal that. We're going to write that book. It's going to be called Gaslight Gothic. Coming in 2024.
You heard it here first. And maybe not 2024.
No, to be fair, thinking about it, definitely not. But yeah, you know, was looking at the state of the world and thought, hey, I wonder if people know that the origins of the term gaslight are really Gothic. And I wonder if they realise the weird overlaps that keep happening to this day with the term Gothic. Gaslight even. There's too many G's. This is my problem with the Gaslight Gatekeep Girl Boss meme. I'm sure it's also because I am an older millennial and not funny anymore. Was I ever? But
I think you're hilarious, Lauren.
Thank you. Yeah. You're the only opinion that matters to me. But yeah, there you go, everybody. Gaslighting. 1944. It's a great film. I would recommend it if you haven't seen it. It's a really good movie. And it does have a happy ending for the most part.
Which is always nice, you know.
Always nice. Because most things don't.
Look at the world.
Look at the state of the world. But yeah, the movie Gaslight has quite a happy ending. And everybody should watch more 1940s Gothic.
Oh yeah.
Not just because it doesn't have jump scares, but because it's really good and I love it. So yeah, there you go. That today's meeting of the Ghoul Guides Association was all about gaslighting and where it comes from.
Thank you, Lauren, for
a really interesting
discussion.
So interesting.
Yes. And I'm very excited to see what you choose to discuss next. Very, very excited.
I have thoughts. I think I'm going to do a more fun one next time. Because last time I talked about, you know, people getting beheaded. And this time I talked about gaslighting.
That is fun.
Yes, it is quite fun, to be honest. Maybe, I do really, you know what I realised as well? Last time we didn't tell the story about the time that we got invited to see a man's guillotine.
Maybe we should save that. We should save that for I don't know, like if we ever do a members only or, you know, some kind of special.
Like a special.
Yeah.
We can tell all of the weird things that men have said to us in professional settings.
Yeah.
That could be its own series.
If you want that, then let us know. And also if you have other ideas, that you want or topics that you want us to discuss, then as always, get in touch with us. Comment below, tweet us at the Ghoul Guides, or you can email us.
At ghoulguides666@gmail.com.
That's the one.
We want to know. You can be like, hey guys, is this Gothic? And then we'll talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's that simple.
Or we'll get you on to talk about it.
Yeah. No one's going to email us if we say that. Well, in the meantime, everybody, this has been the Ghoul Guides Association. I have been Lauren. And
I've been Mary.
And stay safe and stay spooky. We'll see you next time.
Stay spooky.